This is Strides to Solutions podcast, and I am your host, Esther Adams. I want to start today with a sentence that I have heard in one form or another in waiting rooms, in kitchens, in therapy offices, and honestly, in my own head at 2 in the morning. It goes something like this: I don't know what to hope for anymore because there's nothing I can do about it. Maybe the diagnosis came back and the treatment options are limited. Maybe the marriage is ending and you are not the one who decided that. Maybe your child is struggling and you have tried everything the professionals suggested and it has not moved. Maybe you are waiting on an immigration decision, a court date, a biopsy result, living in a war, or a phone call from someone who may never call. The specifics change. The shape of the problem does not. Something enormous is happening to you, and your hands are tied. And here is where a lot of well meaning advice falls apart. Because most of what gets said about hope in our culture assumes you have leverage. Set a goal, make a plan, find your why, visualize the outcome, take one small step. All of that is fine, genuinely, when there are steps to take. But what happens when the step does not exist? What happens when the honest answer to what can you do is nothing actually? That is the question I want to spend the next hour on. And the reason I want to spend an hour on it, rather than 15 minutes with a nice quote at the end, is that the research here is more interesting and more complicated than the self help version lets on. There is a real body of work spanning psychology, philosophy, nursing, palliative medicine, sociology, theology, even a little neuroscience that has been chewing on this exact problem for decades. And what it suggests is that hope does not require control. It changes when control disappears. It becomes something different, but it does not necessarily die. Let me start by cleaning up some vocabulary because I think a lot of the confusion people feel about hope is actually confusion about words that have been used interchangeably when they should not be. Hope is not optimism. This is the single most useful distinction I can hand you, and it is one of the better supported findings in the whole literature. Optimism, roughly, is the belief that things will probably turn out well. It is a probability judgment. It is about likelihood. When a person says, I'm optimistic about the surgery, what they usually mean is, I think the surgery will go fine. Hope works differently. Hope shows up most clearly when the outcome is not likely, but it is still possible, and it matters enormously to you. Researchers have tested this in a bunch of ways, including simply asking ordinary people to describe situations where they felt hopeful versus optimistic. And the pattern that comes back is consistent. When people describe hope, they describe more uncertainty, they describe higher stakes, they describe less personal control. And this part surprised me the first time I read it. They describe more unpleasantness. Hope, in people's actual lived descriptions, is often uncomfortable. It has fear braided into it. Optimism feels breezy. Hope feels like holding something heavy and not putting it down. There was one line of research that used sports outcomes to test this, which I find charming as a design choice. When a team's chances were good, participants used the words hope and optimism more or less interchangeably. When the team's chances were poor but not impossible, people abandoned the word optimism and reached for hope. So the language itself sorts the two constructs when the odds get bad. That tells you something. Hope is the word we use when possibility is thin. Now, hope is also not expectation, and this one matters clinically more than people realize. An expectation is a judgment about what will probably happen based on evidence. A hope is a judgment about what you want and what remains possible. You can expect something you do not want at all. Nobody hopes for the thing they expect when the expectation is bad. Researchers working in healthcare built a whole conceptual model around this split because clinicians kept running into a communication problem. A patient would say something that sounded like a hope, and the clinician would hear it as an expectation and then think the patient was in denial or had not understood the prognosis. But those are different mental acts. A woman with advanced cancer can tell you she understands she is dying, and in the same breath tell you she hopes to see her granddaughter graduate. She is not confused. She is holding a low probability desired possibility, which is exactly what hope is, alongside an accurate expectation. Two things, running in parallel, both true. Faith is a third thing again, and here the research gets murkier, partly because the papers come from different worlds that do not share measurement tools. Psychology has scales. Theology has centuries of argument. They do not always talk to each other well, but the recurring distinction across the sources I looked at is that faith carries a stronger element of trust, often trust in something or someone beyond yourself, and often a transcendent or spiritual dimension. Hope is more future facing and more wanting shaped. Faith can ground hope without being the same as hope. There was one study of cardiac patients that found religious faith contributed to the agency piece of hope indirectly through prayer based coping, which I think is a lovely finding, actually, because it suggests faith functions less as a substitute for hope and more as the floor hope stands on. I want to be honest, though, the evidence separating hope from faith is rated moderate at best in the reviews, weaker than the hope versus optimism distinction, so take that one as a reasonable working idea, not a settled fact. And then there is denial, which is the one people are most afraid of being accused of. Someone hears you hoping for a good outcome against long odds and thinks, quietly, that you are not facing reality. Here is where the literature is genuinely clarifying. The line between hope and denial is not drawn at positivity, it is drawn at reality contact. Denial involves avoiding, distorting, or failing to process the bad information. Realistic hope explicitly includes acknowledgement of the threat and then holds on to whatever positive possibility remains alongside it. So the question is never, are you being too positive? The question is, are you looking at the thing? A parent who can tell you exactly what their child's rare neurological condition means, including the hard parts, and who still hopes for a good year, a comfortable year, a year with more laughing in it than crying, is not in denial. They are doing something psychologically sophisticated. There is a related distinction from the climate psychology world that I keep coming back to, which separates constructive hope from denial based hope. Constructive hope is associated with engagement, with people actually doing things. Denial based hope, the it'll probably be fine, someone will figure it out variety, is associated with disengagement. Same surface emotion, opposite behavior, which suggests that hope is not one thing you either have or lack. It comes in versions, and the versions do different work. All right, vocabulary done. Now, the harder question. The dominant model of hope in psychology, the one that shaped decades of research and a fair amount of therapy practice, treats hope as two components working together. Agency, which is the motivational fuel, the sense that you can get moving and keep moving toward what you want, and pathways, which is the cognitive piece, the ability to see routes to your goal and generate new routes when the first one gets blocked. Agency plus pathways, willpower and way power, roughly. I want to be fair to this model because it has earned its place. Meta-analytic work links both agency thinking and pathways thinking to lower depression and lower anxiety, with agency showing the stronger relationship to depression specifically. Daily life studies show that pathways thinking matters most precisely when obstacles get worse, which fits the theory nicely. When the road is blocked, the person who can imagine detours does better. In educational settings, in workplace stress, in coping research broadly, agentic hope predicts good things. But if agency and pathways are what hope is, then losing control means losing hope by definition. And that is not what happens to people. It is not what the clinical literature describes. It is not what the sociologists find. And it is not, I would guess, what most of you listening have actually experienced. So there is a real fight in the field here. On one side, the agency-centered camp. On the other, philosophers and sociologists and nursing researchers arguing that hope requires only two things, that the outcome be desired and that it remain possible, not probable, not controllable, possible. Under that account, a person with essentially zero influence over an outcome can still hope fully and legitimately, and we should not be demoting that to some lesser category. The reviews I read rate the claim agency is necessary for hope as weakly supported, contested, which is a striking thing to say about the central assumption of the field's most cited model. I find that clarifying in a personal way, honestly. Because if you have ever felt like you were failing at hope, like everyone else had this bootstrapping ability you had lost, it is worth knowing that the definition you are measuring yourself against is itself under serious dispute. So, what actually happens to hope when control goes away? The research suggests it does not vanish, it shifts. And there are a few directions it consistently shifts toward. The first is meaning. There is an integrative model out of the serious illness literature that puts it plainly. Hope emerges in conditions of uncertainty, and when personal control over the outcome is high, hope operates through agency and self efficacy. When control is low, hope moves toward meaning making and transcendence. Same person, same emotion, arguably, different machinery underneath. It stops being about steering and starts being about significance, why this matters, what it means, what it connects to, who it is for. The second shift is regoaling, which is an ugly word for something quite human. People change what they are hoping for. In palliative care research, this shows up over and over. Patients do not typically lose hope when cure becomes unlikely. They redirect it. Hope moves from cure to comfort, from years to months well spent, from beating the thing to not being alone while it happens, from my own health to my kids being okay after. And critically, these hopes coexist. They conflict sometimes, they evolve. A patient can hold three incompatible hopes on the same Tuesday, and that is not pathology. That is a person doing the work. I think we underestimate how much skill this takes. Regoaling under duress is not passive resignation. It is an active cognitive and emotional operation, and some people do it beautifully, and some people need a lot of help to do it at all. And clinicians who do not understand it is happening will mistake it for either denial or giving up, depending on which direction it moves. The third shift is relational. When your own agency is depleted, hope can be carried by other people. This one shows up in psychoanalytic writing, in family resilience work, in studies of marginalized communities. There is a concept from therapeutic work about hopelessness that describes the clinician holding hope on behalf of a patient who cannot hold it themselves. Not pretending, not cheerleading, but genuinely maintaining an orientation toward possibility that the person can lean on until they can carry some of it again. In families dealing with loss, shared belief systems, and collective meaning making do similar work. Hope becomes something distributed across a group rather than generated inside one skull. I want to sit with that for a second because I think it is the most underrated finding in this whole body of work. We treat hope as an individual psychological asset, like grit or self esteem, something you have more or less of, but a lot of the evidence points to hope being socially held, sustained by family, by caring adults, by peers, by community, by God for those who have that, by institutions when institutions function, which reframes what it means to help someone who has lost hope. You are not primarily fixing their cognition. You are being part of the structure that holds it. The fourth shift is toward waiting, and this is where the sociology and anthropology get useful in a way psychology alone does not manage. There is research on people in protracted displacement, refugees living for years in situations they did not choose and cannot exit. And what emerges is a concept sometimes called agency in waiting. People still anticipate alternative futures. They still orient toward possibility. They act in the present, in small ways, in ways that are meaningful, while waiting on outcomes entirely outside their hands. The waiting itself has a texture and an activity to it that looks nothing like passivity from the inside. Related work distinguishes representational hope, which is hope with a picture attached, a specific imagined future with a root to it, from non representational hope, which is hope without a clear object, just an orientation, a refusal to close down. This shows up when futures become genuinely unimaginable, when the usual scripts for how a life goes have stopped applying. And I would guess a lot of people listening have been in that state without having a name for it. That feeling of not knowing what you are hoping for, only that you are still somehow facing forward. Prison research finds something similar. Studies of short term prisoners describe hope persisting as moral reflection, as relational longing, as a kind of vulnerability rather than a plan. Not, here is how I get out and rebuild. More like, here is who I want to be. Here is who I miss. Here is what still matters to me. Hope as identity maintenance under conditions designed to erode identity. Now, let me be honest about the losses, because I do not want to make this sound tidy. Something real does go when agency goes. What tends to drop first is pathways, confidence, the sense that routes exist, that you can make things happen. And this is not trivial. That meta analytic evidence I mentioned earlier links lower agency thinking and lower pathways thinking to more depression and more anxiety. Agency shows the stronger link to depression. So, losing the agentic component of hope is genuinely a risk factor for getting depressed. We should say that clearly rather than romanticizing the low control state. There was one study I found particularly interesting in self help therapy where the two facets came apart in opposite directions. Higher agency predicted completing the program, higher pathways predicted dropping out, which is counterintuitive enough that I do not want to overread a single finding, but it suggests agency and pathways are not simply two sides of one coin. Losing your drive and losing your ability to plan may do different things to you. There is also an experimental finding worth flagging because it complicates the story in a useful way. When people feel they have control, hope predicts their specific expectations about outcomes. When people feel they have no control, hope stops predicting expectations and optimism takes over that role instead. So, under uncontrollability, hope may become less tied to what you actually think will happen and more purely about orientation and desire, which fits everything else we have said, but it also means the hope you have in a no control situation is doing something different from the hope you had before. It is not just weaker, it is functionally distinct. And there is a failure mode. Hopeful waiting can slide into resignation. The displacement research is explicit about this. Active waiting keeps people afloat, but the same posture, held too long without any change in conditions, can flatten into something that is no longer hope at all. That transition is not well characterized in the literature, as far as I can tell, and I think it is one of the more important open questions. Where exactly is the line between enduring and giving up? What tips someone across it? Nobody has a clean answer. Let me turn to the stress and helplessness research, because this is where the practical stakes come into focus. Hope is consistently associated with lower stress and lower anxiety and better well being during long, grinding stressors. Pandemic research provided an unfortunate natural experiment for this, and the findings held across a lot of samples and countries. Longitudinal work suggests part of how hope does this runs through perceived emotional control, not control over the situation, control over your own emotional response to the situation. That is a meaningful distinction, and I want to underline it. Hope may protect you during uncontrollable events, partly by supporting your sense that you can manage your own internal state even when the external state is a mess. There is a whole literature on learned helplessness sitting adjacent to this. In hemodialysis patients, the group with the highest helplessness and resignation was marked by lower hope and lower family support. Notice both variables. It is not just the internal state, it is the internal state plus the surrounding structure. Among nursing students, higher hope functioned as a protective factor against learned helplessness. In diabetes distress research, learned helplessness predicted distress more strongly than hope did, but hope still showed a real inverse relationship. So hope is protective, but it is not a magic shield, and helplessness may be the stronger force in some contexts. A large meta analysis across many studies found that positive expectancies predicted lower PTSD symptoms, with hope showing a moderately strong inverse association. Interestingly, hope was more strongly associated than optimism in the cross sectional data, which is worth pausing on. In the aftermath of trauma, which is close to the definitional case of an uncontrollable event, hope appears to do more work than optimism does. That is consistent with everything else we have covered. Optimism is for situations where good outcomes are plausible. Hope is for the other kind. There is also work on locus of control that complicates a simple story. Among survivors of intimate partner violence, both internal locus of control and what researchers call powerful others locus of control were positively associated with hope, meaning believing that you can influence outcomes supported hope, and so did believing that trusted others could influence outcomes. That second one matters. It suggests hope does not require that you personally be the agent. It may be enough that someone you trust is, which loops back to the relational finding and gives it a mechanism. There is a body of work on older adults living with chronic illness that I found more moving than I expected, and it is worth describing because it shows what all this looks like at ground level, away from dramatic cases. A meta synthesis pulling together qualitative studies found that hope in this population stayed dynamic, not static, not steadily draining, but moving, and what it oriented toward was strikingly ordinary, an ordinary life. Small daily goals that gave the day a shape, meaningful relationships. This is against a background of genuine uncertainty about treatment, about decline, about how much time is left and in what condition. The hope did not attach itself to cure, it attached itself to Tuesday. I keep thinking about that because when we talk about hope, we tend to reach for the big frame, the survival story, the against all odds recovery. But a lot of hope in real life is dramatically smaller than that, and the smallness may be the point. It is more available. It is less likely to be destroyed by a bad scan. Someone whose hope is entirely staked on cure has one point of failure. Someone whose hope is distributed across a garden, a grandchild's phone calls, a weekly card game, and a decent night's sleep has considerably more resilience built into the structure. There is another direction hope goes that I do not want to skip, which is collective. There is political philosophy work on what gets called strong democratic hope, which explicitly acknowledges individual powerlessness and yet argues that hope can still stabilize patience and sustained collective action. The idea being that you can accept fully that you personally cannot change the thing and still participate in a slow shared project that might. Related work on climate reaches a similar place from the other side, arguing that treating doom as settled is a form of unwarranted fatalism rather than a hard-nosed conclusion, which is a good reminder that despair also makes a probability claim, and it can be just as unjustified as naive optimism. Certainty about the bad outcome is still certainty, and the evidence usually does not support it. I find that framing useful for personal situations too, not just political ones. When someone tells me nothing will get better, they are making a forecast, and forecasts can be wrong in both directions. The honest position under genuine uncertainty is not optimism and it is not despair. It is the acknowledgement that you do not know, which is precisely the space where hope operates. One more complication before we move on, and it is a philosophical one that I think has real practical bite. There is an argument in the literature that hope is not under direct voluntary control. You cannot simply decide to hope the way you can decide to stand up. You shape it indirectly through what you attend to, who you spend time with, what you expose yourself to, what meaning you construct, which is either discouraging or liberating depending on your angle. Discouraging because there is no switch. Liberating because it means that if you cannot summon hope on command, you are not failing at something that was ever directly available to you. You work on the conditions, not the feeling. And that is a very different instruction than choose hope, which I have always found to be one of the emptier things people say. There is some evidence the conditions can be worked on deliberately. A small intervention study using hope focused therapy with diabetes patients reported reduced hopelessness and increased internal locus of control. I want to flag the sample was very small, so I would not build a life philosophy on it. But it is at least consistent with the broader picture that hope responds to structured intervention rather than being a fixed trait you either got or did not. And on the trait question, there is longitudinal work following tens of thousands of adults over time, linking hope to resilience and to faster recovery from negative life events. The causal direction is not settled. It could be that hope helps you recover, or that people who recover more easily report more hope, or both feeding each other. The authors are appropriately careful about this. But the association is there and it persists over long stretches of life, which suggests hope is not just a momentary mood that dissolves under pressure. I should say something about the neuroscience, mainly to manage expectations. If you were hoping I would tell you that hope lights up a specific brain circuit and here is what it is, I cannot do that honestly. The neural evidence is early and mostly about helplessness rather than hope. There is human work tying learned helplessness to control related processing involving cingulate cortex function and midline theta activity, with some suggestion that the development of helplessness could be experimentally influenced. Small sample. The authors themselves flag the limits. In animals, learned hopefulness and learned helplessness showed opposite effects on a specific connection between two brain regions, and stimulating that circuit rescued helplessness related deficits. That is a genuinely interesting finding, but it is a long way from a human brain circuit for hope. And there is a related idea I want to address because it is floating around and it sounds more established than it is. The notion that agentic hope and receptive hope, the doing kind and the enduring kind, are two distinct neurological modes. As a psychological distinction, this has real support. Multiple literatures independently arrive at some version of it: agentic versus receptive, active versus enduring, representational versus non representational, agency centered versus socially embedded, different fields, similar cut. But as a neurological claim, no, nobody has shown two neural systems for two modes of hope. The one computational paper in this area places hope within planning under uncertainty generally, not in a two mode architecture. So it is a plausible hypothesis worth testing. It is not a fact, and I would be skeptical of anyone who presents it as one. Now, what do we actually do with all of this? I want to give you something usable, but I also do not want to hand you a 5-step method, partly because that would betray the whole point of the episode, and partly because the research does not support one. What I can offer is a set of reframes that I think change how the experience feels from the inside. The first is permission. You are allowed to hope for things you cannot cause. The dominant psychological model of hope, the one that has quietly shaped how we talk about this, says hope needs agency. That claim is genuinely contested in the scholarly literature. So if you have been feeling like your hope is illegitimate because you cannot back it with a plan, know that a lot of serious people think that standard is too narrow. Wanting a good outcome that remains possible is hope. Full stop. You do not need a strategy to qualify. The second is that honesty does not kill hope. This one comes out of the palliative care literature, and it is one of the most consistently replicated findings there. A systematic review on sustaining hope in communication with terminally ill patients and their families found, essentially, that patients generally prefer accurate, empathic information, and that they can maintain hope while acknowledging their prognosis. Related work found patients with advanced cancer holding hope alongside realistic illness expectations. So the instinct we all have to protect people from bad news in order to preserve their hope is mostly wrong. What protects hope is not vagueness, it is honesty delivered with care and with company. This applies well outside medicine, by the way. It applies to how you talk to your kids about a family crisis, how you talk to your team about a bad quarter, how you talk to yourself at 3 in the morning. The third is to check what you are hoping for and whether it needs to change. Regoaling is not surrender. If the original hope has become impossible rather than merely unlikely, the question is not whether to give up hope, but where to move it. And there are usually more available objects than people initially see: comfort, connection, meaning, time, someone else's future, the kind of person you are while this happens to you. Those are all legitimate objects of hope, and none of them require the original outcome. The fourth is to notice whether your hope is doing constructive work or disengagement work. That climate psychology distinction generalizes. If your hope makes you show up, ask questions, stay in contact, take the small available actions, that is the good kind. If your hope makes you stop looking at the situation, avoid the conversations, and wait passively for it to resolve itself, that is closer to the denial variety, and it tends to make outcomes worse, not better. The test is behavioral, not emotional. What is the hope causing you to do? The fifth is about other people, and it is the one I would put first if I were ranking these by importance rather than by order of argument. If your own hope is depleted, that is not a character failure, and it is not something you have to solve alone inside your head. The evidence points repeatedly toward hope being held socially, by family, by friends, by clinicians, by communities of faith, by anyone willing to stay oriented toward possibility on your behalf for a while. And that trusted other's finding suggests it may genuinely function, not just feel nice. If you cannot hope right now, borrow. If someone you love cannot hope right now, hold it for them and do not make them perform gratitude for it. I want to close with a critique because I think this literature has a blind spot and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Almost all of this research treats hope as a good thing to be preserved, and mostly it is, but there is very little serious work on when hope should end, on when the honest and healthy move is to stop hoping for something and grieve it instead. The literature separates hope from denial conceptually, and it says, correctly, that denial is hard to diagnose in practice, but it does not give clinicians or families much help with the actual judgment call. When is this person holding realistic hope? And when are they using hope to avoid a grief they need to start? I do not think anyone has answered that well, and the practical cost of not answering it falls on families in hospital corridors making decisions with incomplete guidance. There is also, I think, a cultural thing running underneath the research that does not get named enough. The agency-based model of hope is a very particular kind of model. It fits a culture that prizes self-direction, individual achievement, and the belief that outcomes follow effort. The receptive, socially held, endurance-based accounts tend to come from research done with people who have less structural power: displaced people, prisoners, chronically ill older adults, marginalized communities, which raises an uncomfortable question about whose experience got to define the construct in the first place. The dominant model may describe hope as experienced by people who mostly do have control, and then we exported that definition to everyone else and told them they were doing it wrong. I do not have a resolution for that, but I think it is worth naming, because if you have felt that the standard advice about hope was written for someone whose life was more cooperative than yours, you may have been right. So, where does that leave us? Hope, in the best synthesis I can build from this material, is a desire-laden openness to a good future that remains possible. Not likely, possible. That is it. It does not require control. It does not require a plan. It does not require you to feel hopeful. And there is genuine philosophical work separating hoping for something from being hopeful about it, which means you can be doing the first while feeling nothing like the second, which I suspect describes a lot of people at their lowest, and I would like them to know that what they are doing still counts. When control disappears, hope tends to get less strategic and more existential. It moves toward meaning, toward relationship, toward waiting with an orientation, toward smaller and more available objects. It gets harder to sustain and more vulnerable to sliding into resignation, which is why the people around you matter so much during those stretches. But it does not require that you be able to fix anything. It never did, actually. We just built a definition that implied it. If you are in one of those seasons right now, waiting on something you cannot influence, I want to leave you with the least sentimental version of this I can manage. You do not have to generate hope. You do not have to feel it. You have to keep the possibility open. Look at the situation honestly. Let other people carry some of it and find out what is still worth wanting. That is enough. That is the whole thing. Thank you for spending this time with me. This has been Strides to Solutions podcast. I am Esther Adams, and I will see you next time.